were very generous to meet with us. I have a whole biography here. I don't want to read the whole bio, but I'll highlight a few things, which first off, the book we're going to focus our attention on is How Women Rise, which is a book, which as you can see, I've gone through pretty carefully, that she co-authored with Marshall Goldsmith, but Sally is the author of many other books. Let me just make sure I get my titles correctly here. Her groundbreaking book was The Web of Inclusion, a new architecture for building great organizations. But her work that really marked her, I think, and Sally, you can correct me if you see it differently, is The Female Vision, Women's Real Power at Work. And then your book, the best-selling The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership. Her work has been so impressive that Forbes magazine referred to her as the world's leading expert on women and leadership. And so I'm really thrilled you're here, really grateful for your time. Marshall was kind enough to present at our conference a couple of years ago, and it's great to meet the brains behind the book along with him. So it's great to see you.
Well, he would say that, so that's
Well, it was great to see him, and it was wonderful. We have just kind of a warm-up question, kind of to get going, and we'll also keep an eye on chat. There may be something that pops up, and please feel free to say, let's go on to a different question if that one's not working for you, and let's keep this friendly and informal. And but it is a really, really important topic for us, because either we are working with a majority of women, or we are women in our work. The vast majority of people who are coaches are female, and I think your book just speaks directly to the challenges that I see them facing. So I really want to hear your take on it. But the warm-up question is, what's something you're grateful for right now?
Right now, I'm grateful to have stayed well for the last 8 months. And I'm very grateful that I live in a place where people are safe in their practices. And so we've weathered this pretty well. And I'm aware of the pain that a lot of people have lived with. And for me, it's been a time of learning and very fascinating period. And I'm just grateful that I was in a position where this was not something that was extremely destructive or frightening. And just consider that fortunate and a blessing.
It is a little scary in the sense that it's always out there. You never know what might happen. But I feel the same. I feel very grateful. We've weathered it. We haven't lost a job. We're not worried about our job all changing. We're not worried about our health. We haven't lost a family member. So I think those are the things that make sense to be grateful for. Tell me a bit about the experiences that led you to the writing you've been doing, but in particular, just your whole interest in women in leadership. What led you to want to study that?
It was very organic, my interest in women in leadership. I started off as a journalist and was mainly a journalist in the 1970s. In the 80s, I was very involved in corporate communications and was working at a number of terrific companies in New York City that were quite, progressive and good companies. But it was very clear to me in the 80s how little they understood what potential women had as leaders. And it wasn't just that it affected me, it affected all the women that I saw. And I really felt organizations needed some instruction on what women could offer as leaders. So I started doing some research, which became the book, The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, published in 1990. It was the first book that looked at what women had to contribute as leaders rather than how they needed to change and adapt. Before that, whether it was academic or popular, everything was focused on how women could be more like men and therefore succeed as leaders. So it was the first time. And since it was a new point of view, it got a lot of response, and companies, associations, law firms, universities, school systems, etc., began calling me and asking me to come speak and give advice, etc. So the career really evolved from that. It was me seeing something that I thought was a problem, trying to address it by doing some research and writing, and then following up on that and being willing to follow, to follow that path, which wasn't that intuitive at the time because I was doing well in corporate communications. And a lot of people said, "Are you out of your mind?" when I decided to leave and go out on my own and sort of pursue a women's leadership as a career path. It didn't really exist then.
I've got a question. Is there a single learning experience that really catalyzed this whole thing, that had a big impact on this work? Anything that stands out as a single experience?
When you say this work, do you mean my work as a whole, or are you referring to How Women Rise, or?
I think your work as a whole, but you can change the question however you like, whatever you want to answer.
I do. I think that the women I chose to interview, to focus on, it wasn't really interviews. I was doing diary studies in the female advance. One of them was Frances Hesselbein, who at that time in the late 80s was the executive director, the CEO of the Girl Scouts USA. And I had become aware of her as a leader because of an article I'd read in which Peter Drucker said, the sort of father of modern management, said that he considered her as fine as any leader in the country and capable of leading General Motors. So I was, of course, intrigued, since I was writing a book about women as leaders. And I had the opportunity to spend time with her, to get to know her. Last month, I attended on Zoom her 105th birthday.
I know. I was looking her up as in sort of in prep for today, and it was like born in 1915, and I'm like, now wait a minute, 1915. That's astonishing. So, but anyway, carry on. Sorry.
And what I saw in the diary study I did of her was extraordinary level of intentionality in every single thing she said or did, which didn't make her canned or uptight. But she felt that as someone who was in a leadership position, she knew everybody was looking and interpreting everything she said. So she was so intentional about what she was trying to achieve. And she was able to articulate what she was trying to achieve, which of course is what a writer is always looking for when writing about someone. That I think she gave me something to aspire to, and a way of thinking about how I could be a leader, even though, I don't lead an institution or an organization. I'm just a person out there in the world. But that was very inspiring, and it was kind of steadying for me. And have, obviously I've stayed close to her for now over 30 years. And she also helped me reframe my career at a moment when I had some real concerns. So if you want to talk about that, I can do that. I do a lot of speaking, travel around the world. And when I was in my early 60s, I became concerned because I started thinking, my audiences are getting younger, I'm getting older. When are people going to say, in essence, where'd they dig her up? So I was concerned about it. And I was having that conversation with other women who did what I did, who were my age. And then I was at a retreat with Frances, and she was doing this yoga. She was lying on the floor doing some yoga, which is what we were doing as an exercise. She was 98 at that time. And I just looked over in her and I thought, if I lived as long as her, which my doctor tells me is not an unreasonable expectation, I would be mid-career. I was like 63 then. I would be mid-career now. So I decided to take as my motto, mid-career at 65. And it changed all my thinking about how I do my work, who I am in the world, and my ability really to show up for my work and to inspire people.
You might just be changing my world today too, as I think about that, because it's the very thoughts I've been running through my mind. There reaches a point where you think maybe Maybe they're going to look at me and think, who is this old man? So, but maybe they'll still say that, but I like the mid-career.
Yeah.
Can you think of a couple things from Frances's diary that you feel comfortable sharing that would sort of illustrate what you mean by her intentionality?
Yes,
What
certainly.
are some of the things she would do?
Well, for example, and she did this, I've almost never seen a leader do this. She had a phone call. Remember, this is the Girl Scouts. It was some controversy to do with cookies, actually. She had a phone call with a reporter at the New York Times. And so what she did, she prepared for the phone call and, talked about it with her communications people. And then she invited 7 very young people from the staff to come into her office and just sit there while she made the phone call. Now, she didn't explicitly say, now watch how this is done, but that's what she was doing. That's the reason she had those young people there. And I remember thinking, I've been studying people in leadership positions a lot, and I've never seen anyone do that, give access to extremely junior people so they can see what doing something at a high leadership level looks like. So that was a very intentional action on her part that she kind of made it subtly clear, but she didn't articulate it. One thing I also remember from that, which I wrote about, and she always teased me, I noticed that before the call came in, she put on lipstick very carefully and rearranged her scarf. Now, it was the telephone, but it was just a way of inhabiting the fact that she was showing up representing her organization. And, she said for years afterwards, she said, I fly all over the world and people come up to me in airports and say, oh, you're Frances Hesselbein. You put on lipstick before a phone call. So there were just very, very vivid demonstrations that I saw in her. Yeah.
Now, both you and Marshall talk about her as an incredibly spectacular listener. Can you tell me a bit about what she did? Because many of our people, listening is what they do. It's probably their number one. Questions and listening would be the heart of what an instructional coach does. So what was it she did as a listener that made her so unique?
She listened very patiently. And I think, and she always talked about getting that to some degree from Peter Drucker.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that was extraordinary about Peter Drucker, and I was very privileged in the 90s to get to know him and have dinner with him on a couple occasions and go to his 90th birthday party. One of the things about Peter is he had this rule for himself that he was always the last person to speak in a meeting, in a situation. And that was because he knew that if he spoke first, everybody would agree with him. So he'd never find out what anybody thought. He was used to being the 500-pound gorilla in the room. And he took that very seriously and wanted to hear what other people had to say. So what you saw, if you were in a meeting with him, was he would just sit there and intently listen. And it was a way of demonstrating to me, because, after all, he was Peter Drucker, humility and patience. And I saw Frances come to inhabit that, a kind of humility and patience. And you'd say something, excuse me a sec, somebody would say something and you knew she had some response, but she would always say, is there anything more? So she would encourage them to amplify and discover what they thought before she weighed in. It was very powerful. Excuse me.
Well, it's a way of communicating respect too, I suppose. She's saying, I see you as a person who's valuable. I respect your opinion. I want to hear your opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, these are powerful things. In the book, How Women Rise, you talk about 12 things that hold people back, behaviors that hold women back in particular. And there's just a couple terms you use before we get into a few of those All 12 of them are really fascinating, though. And it is interesting to think of them. I think for men who would read the book, it would give them some insight on how they could lead better, because they could
Oh,
say, I wonder,
yeah.
well, what do you think about that?
Well, you know, what's interesting about it, and this has been one of the big surprises, is that that book has resulted in me doing dozens of programs for senior teams, read men, at, you know, private equity firms and major pension funds and energy companies. I mean, you name it. I'm doing one next week, yet another one for a construction company. So it has resulted because in them being interested in how understanding some of these habits can make them more effective as mentors, sponsors, bosses, colleagues, direct reports, whatever, to women. So that has been one of the biggest surprises of the book for me, is that men have been very interested in it and see it, I think, because it's so tactical, behavioral, and practical, as something that can help them get better.
Well, I'll just go off on a little tangent here for a sec. I was working with a major school district in the Midwest, and the first day was principals and coaches, and it was kind of mixed in terms of gender, you know, quite a few men and women in the room. And the next day was coaches. And the next day there were maybe 2 men left in the room. All the men had left, and all the men had the male positions. And it's not uncommon for a small percentage of males in a school to end up in the leadership positions. And it's always struck me that if an organization is going to thrive because of the collective intelligence of the group, it seems crazy not to welcome the intelligence of women and always just put men in those kind of positions. So I think your book, How Women Rise, what it does is it says, you know, do not miss out on what these women would bring to your organization. And here are some things to think about. That's what I was thinking as I read it.
It's also a timing question, which is there's much more openness to it.
Right.
I've been doing this 30 years, and 30 years ago, they didn't care, really.
Right.
Or it was a
Right.
very, very rare person. You were not going to get the senior team of a global equity firm listening to me for 2 hours talk about this to help them be better with women. There just was not an appetite for it.
Well, one of the things you say is people get stuck. So what do you mean by stuck? If it's kind of a obvious thing, but just to set the stage, what do you mean by how people get themselves stuck, and how do they get unstuck?
Well, what it really means in the context of How Women Rise is you look at what your talents and skills are. You see the match between what your talents and skills and your potential is and where you want to be. And where you are doesn't match it at all. And you don't seem to be making the progress you would expect, or that other people might expect you would be making. And when that situation occurs, it obviously sometimes there are extrinsic factors. There have been huge budget cuts and nobody's going anywhere. But it often is the result of some habit, some behavior, some pattern of behaviors, some belief system on your part that's getting in your way. And saying that isn't to say that there aren't cultural and structural barriers that continue to hold women back. I see them every day and have been working with them for 30 years. But there are also internal, to some degree, self-sabotaging beliefs and behaviors. And that's specifically what How Women Rise is designed to address. Those things lie within our control, which is why I like to focus on them. Decades ago, Stephen Covey in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People said something I'll never forget. He said the most effective people are those whose circle of concern aligns most with their circle of control. So that where you're not concerned about a lot of things that you can't control. One thing we can control is our own behaviors, and we can develop habits that serve us better. And that's what How Women Rise is, as I said, designed to address.
I'm fortunate to work with lots of different people, and I see a lot of people and I get to know them pretty well. And I am stunned all the time how, maybe stunned's not the right word, but I'm struck by how brilliant people don't see how brilliant they are. They don't see what they could accomplish. I work with people, I have very close friends where I'm like, you could do so much more. Why hold back? Is that part of being stuck, do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's self-limiting beliefs and belief systems that keep us stuck. They're one of the things that keep us stuck. And also, just, Marshall said something that really had an impact on me. He said that in 40 years of being a coach, now granted, about 80%, 75, 80% of his coachees have been men because they've been CEOs. But he's worked with extraordinary women, generals in the army and leaders of major nonprofits and CEOs, et cetera. He says he has never worked with a woman, diplomats, where he hasn't had to at one point say, please don't be so hard on yourself. So it's also the expectations that we have and that whole system of things that gets in our way, which once we see them articulated, once we see how they play out in everyday situations and can envision alternate scenarios and then try out different behaviors, we can get ourselves unstuck.
Now you talk about 12 behaviors that hold people back, and I wanted to just touch on a few of them, and if there's some you really want to make sure I address, I'd be happy to do it. But the first one I want to talk about is how, in your book, you talk about how women expect others to, your phrase is, spontaneously notice and reward you without you ever doing something. Tell me a bit about what that means.
Well, exactly. Expecting others to spontaneously notice and reward your contributions. This most often happens when women are reluctant to talk about their achievements. They either minimize what they've done. Oh, that was a great job. Oh, it wasn't really that hard. Or they deflect. They don't want to look like they're hogging credit from their team. So they'll say, oh, well, it was my team or my boss or whatever. They'll automatically give credit to other people. They'll have an idea. They'll have something they've done articulated by someone else right in front of them, and they won't say anything. They don't want to look pushy. And so because of that reluctance to claim achievements, they will often adopt the strategy of hoping others notice. And people rarely notice unless we bring some attention to it, unless we gather allies who can support us and represent us, and unless we're very clear about what we're trying to contribute. And what is so problematic about this, and I've seen it thousands of times, is that when you don't step up, then you generally are under-recognized and you come to feel undervalued. And that can begin to make you detach from a job, a company, an organization, a school system, whatever it is, where actually you're very well suited. You feel because you're under-recognized, well, they'll never understand what I could do. And when I've interviewed so many women who've left good positions, and one of the things I often hear, I'd say the most common, is they just never understood what I could have done there. And you have a responsibility to some degree, if you want to avoid that situation, to figure out how you're going to let them know.
You talk about allies being a part of that and being part of helping yourself be seen, I guess. What's the role of allies in all of that? And why are allies so important? You talk a lot about the power of allies.
Yeah, well, the ally thing is just very, very important. And where women often tend to be really, really good at building relationships. But allies are a little bit different in that there's some degree of leverage involved. An ally is someone that you support and supports you. And that doesn't mean that it's very explicit or a quid pro quo. Hey, you recommend me for this and I'll recommend you for that. Not at all. It's just that you have an investment to some degree in one another's success. Now, what I've noticed, again, I've been around a long time, is that women will often come into a new position and they'll say something like, I've got a big learning curve here. So for the first 3 months or whatever, I'm going to keep my head down and I'm going to really try to learn. I'm going to try to get good at this job, and then I can look up and I can start to build my network and I can start to build support. Often they're doing this because they don't want to be seen before they feel really confident that they've mastered the skills.
Mm-hmm.
But by contrast, when I see a very successful man, or women sometimes do this too, who become very successful, they walk in and the first question they ask is, who do I need to know in order to make sure that what I do here is successful? Because they understand we really can't do this alone. And just having your head down and trying to become expert because you're afraid somebody's going to see you before you are expert. Guess what? You just took over the job. How can you really know how to do it? And this is very important, I think, for coaches to help people with. How can you know how to do a job that you've never done before? No one really expects that. And yet women will often feel shy about letting other people in until they feel comfortable with that. So building allies, number one, start immediately. Look around for people that whose support would be helpful for you and think of ways you could support them. Get comfortable with the idea of leveraging the relationships you have rather than just building them, but using them to achieve either a tactical job related or strategic, that is career related objective, and think of ways that you in turn could be helpful to them. When I look at people who have very successful careers, that's the path that they've taken. They have not tried to do it alone.
So if I'm a coach in a school, let me see if I'm thinking about this correctly. I might want to find people who are going to help me improve my skills. So I might want to look around and say, who are the people who are really pros at this job, and how can I call on them to help me? And then I might also want to say, who are the informal leaders in this school itself that I can go to? These people, if they get on board with coaching, the rest will follow. Is that kind of the way you would see it?
Absolutely, especially the second. Who are the informal leaders here? Because it's not really at all, when you're looking at allies, it's not just you're not just looking for people with positional power. And that's a mistake people often make. The people who have the strong ally networks, it's usually people at all different levels that they interact with. Because when you have all those relationships, that helps you be a go-to person. It helps you get someone who can get resources to flow. So it's very helpful to think of allies not in terms of just positional power. I think to some degree over the last 10 years, especially with women, we've been encouraged to over-focus on mentors and sponsors, very important. However, that's not the only game in town. And very often, mentors and sponsors will be attracted by people who've managed to build very strong ally networks. That makes them look like a good bet to mentor or sponsor.
Dan Pink has this idea, it's probably comes from someone else, but of sitting in a meeting and drawing a line between where the conversation goes between each person. So it starts here and then it goes here. And then you can look at your drawing afterwards and say, who is the person that people kept turning to get the yes and no from? Who's the person with the power in the room? And it sounds like that's it's kind of a funny thing. I'm curious what you think about this, but you certainly want to be authentic with the person. You don't want to use people, but at the same time, you want to be strategic. It's a little almost paradoxical. Is that fair to say, or do you see it differently?
No, I see it as paradoxical to some extent. And often the reason women will back off from, making a request, I'm glad you like that idea. Since you like that idea, might you feel comfortable talking about it with, bringing it up with your boss or mentioning it in the next meeting, something like that. But when I say, why didn't you do that? And this happens to me in my coaching practice too. I'll hear, well, I didn't want that person to think I was a user, or I wanted that person to know that I really value them as a friend. So you're making it into kind of an either or, either pure friendship, or it's just purely transactional, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. But really effective allyships are all that space in between. And it can be really very freeing to make a request. Let me give you an example. How Women Rise really came, the idea for it came from Marshall's terrific book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which is about the habits and behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful people. And I thought his idea was brilliant, that the same habits and behaviors that serve us well early in our careers can become a problem later on. But I noticed that a lot of the habits that he focused on were not necessarily germane to women, like don't always talk about how great you are, or learn to apologize and stuff like that, or really, Marshall. So I had, this idea, and some people had also voiced it, of collaborating with him and taking that concept and looking at it for women. But I held back on that for about a year because I thought, oh, he's going to think I'm trying to use him. He's got 1 million LinkedIn followers. So he thinks I'm going to, and he's great, known to be a fantastic marketer, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's what held me back, because I didn't want him to think that I was using him. And when I finally worked up the courage and asked him, his response was, whoa, that's a great idea. I'm really looking to have, up my profile with women and have, more and more companies have women in positions of power. And I want to be seen as a women's champion. And that would be fantastic. So it was that classic win-win, to use a cliche, that he saw it as. And the furthest thing from his mind was, well, Sally's trying to use me because I've got, all these social media followers. It was not on his mind at all. So that was a big breakthrough for me, and made me feel, a lot more comfortable just in general with thinking about, how allyships work and how we can turn them into things that work for us and also work for our allies.
And you think of how many people don't have that. I mean, they don't make the call. They don't say, let's do the partnership, and the opportunity disappears without ever happening. So that's a great point. What's the worst could happen if you call versus what's the worst that happened? You can't call. Probably the call is worth the call, Another one you talk about is putting your job before your career. Tell me what that means.
Well, this is often very, very common with women, investing everything in the job you have in the belief that if you do the best job at the job you have, you will be promoted. And that is not necessarily true. Because there may be other factors. Other people have a better network. Other people have made themselves more visible. And it's very discouraging when you pour everything into your job and you feel like you're the person who was doing the best job, and then someone else gets promoted. You can feel like, whoa, what happened here? But very often it's because you poured everything into the job you have and just anticipated that that was going to be seen as qualifying for the next job. And so that can be very disappointing. Another thing about putting your job before your career, as we know, we've seen a lot of research that shows that women are extremely loyal, tend to be very loyal to their organizations, to their boss, to their team, etc. And I cannot tell you how many women I've worked with over the years who've said, yeah, I probably could go for this other job, but oh, I just feel that my team would, you know, you know, they're basically saying my team would be lost without me, or I'd be betraying my
Mm,
team, or, I wouldn't do that to my boss. And so it's kind of a loyalty trap that they get stuck in that doesn't serve them. But, in some ways it may not serve the people that they're trying to some degree appease by staying where they are. Because, for example, your team can often benefit by your going to a higher position, because then they'll know you, they'll have you as a connection, and that's good
right.
for them. So it's kind of overlooking those sorts of things. And I this habit, I was talking about this habit at a conference in Atlanta. It was a legal conference. And this one woman came up to me, and it was very affecting. She said, reading that chapter about putting your job before your career, she said, it made me realize, she said, when I came to my firm, I saw they didn't have anyone who was really good at writing briefs. So I decided I was going to become the best brief writer. And she said, I poured everything into it. And she said, I am a phenomenal brief writer. And everybody here wants me to write their briefs. And as a result, I've spent 14 years writing briefs. I haven't been promoted because, she'd made herself invaluable in terms of the quality of the brief she was writing. And that's very common too, with that putting your job before your career, is you make yourself invaluable, so the people around you are not motivated to promote you.
Right. Here's how I see that playing out for the people I work with. Instructional coaches, often their funding is tenuous, and they've won a grant for the next 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years, we don't know what's going to happen to the position. And so it's a pretty compelling job to have, because what you're doing is you're helping teachers reach more students, and every time you help a teacher, every other student they ever teach is going to be affected by your impact. If you want to make a difference in people's lives, this is a great job to do. And so people pour their hearts into being coaches, and they become really skilled, and they affect change, but they don't make it public what's happening. And so when it's time to make cuts, the easiest thing to do is to cut the coach. We can keep the teaching, and people don't know what the loss will be because they haven't publicized what they do. Does that fit with what you're talking about?
Exactly. That's pouring your energy. It's overvaluing expertise. It's undervaluing the role of visibility and connections or network. And certainly putting your job before your career, and before a sustainable career. And so it's part of making your ideas successful, is not just enacting them, but also in getting known for them and getting that recognition. In this case, as you're describing, so that you can do it on some kind of sustainable basis. And I understand why that happens. Probably the coaches feel like, well, the credit should go to the teachers, and it's all about the teachers, etc. But if you're wanting to maintain your viability as an instructional coach, you want to have a plan, you want to be intentional about getting known for the value that you contribute by articulating that and finding others who can amplify the message.
I mean, to make the difference you want to make, you have to have the position, and to keep the position, you have to make it public. And so I think it's I better get moving on here, because I've got a few other things, but it's a great point. So tell me about the perfection trap. I mean,
the perfection trap. Where do we start? This is so common with women.
Clearly, I'm not doing that. So.
One of the interesting things that I learned doing, when we were doing some research, because you always think about the perfection trap as being, how girls are encouraged to be the perfect student and rewarded for that. And parents often, have more tolerance for naughty little boys, certainly than naughty little girls. So you think that's where it came from. But one thing we learned is that in general, organizations of all kinds tend to reward and promote women based on their being precise and correct. So women get the message and indeed achieve some degree of success because they've learned to be precise and correct, whereas men are more likely, you can think about this in terms of hierarchy and higher in education as well, men are more likely to be rewarded and promoted based on the perception that they're big picture or strategic thinkers, based on the quality of their network, because a lot of senior positions are more outward facing, so that becomes important, and based on their visibility and their ability to promote and publicize what they do. So those are very different criteria. So women get the message, oh, being precise and correct is the way to go, and inhabit that. And then, but when you get into a much more senior position, that attention to detail, first of all, can identify you as not being leadership material, because nobody says, oh, that person's a really great leadership potential because they're precise and correct with all the details. That's not part of what most organizations are looking for in terms of leadership. So you identify yourself as sort of not leader-like.
Right.
But also you just create a lot of stress. You create a lot of stress for yourself, but most importantly, you create a lot of stress for other people. Maybe not most importantly, the stress you create for yourself is pretty important, but you create a lot of stress for other people. And when I see women who are remarkably accomplished, who don't get the promotion that you would think that they might get, it's often because they're perceived of as a perfectionist who's judgmental in terms of other people's performance, who takes over other people's work because other people can't do it perfectly, so you wear yourself out doing the work. But the stress you create has a broader effect when you're at a senior position. So I see a lot of that.
So being a perfectionist and doing the little things extremely well can decrease the likelihood that you'll be promoted to the big picture positions, to the bigger positions. So like a curriculum coordinator who's really meticulous at all they do might actually be holding herself back from becoming associate or superintendent because people see them as dealing with the little stuff but not having the big picture.
Exactly. It's very much like the woman who became the greatest brief writer in Atlanta.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Very similar kind of situation, yes.
That's fascinating. How about the disease to please? Tell us about that one.
Disease to please is basically the desire, and you see this a lot in helping professions, which of course education is to some degree. The desire, it can be anywhere on the spectrum from desire to need, to be thought of as wonderful, empathic person by virtually everybody. So you're trying to manage everyone's perceptions about you and putting that first. Now, this is a classic what got you here won't get you there, because pleasers tend to be wonderful, nice people. And that helps them in their career to a certain level because people like them. So that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with being liked, and there's nothing wrong with wanting people to like you. But it's when you become you let people get dependent on, you become dependent on what everybody's opinion of you is. That's a recipe for failure at a leadership level, because you're going to have a hard time holding people to account. You're always going to be giving people a break, even when it's not that necessary. And you'll probably swoop in and do other people's jobs. You know, in the book, the example I used was a woman. It was quite near the Hudson Valley. She was in a big hospital system, and she'd been head of community relations, and people just adored her. The families, the patients, you know, she was beloved in the community, and she moved on to quite a high administrative level. And all the families and the patients were saying, well, we still want to work with her. Oh, we liked her. We don't want to work with this new person. So she was doing two jobs. And it wasn't really until it was pointed out to her by her coach, that, which is not me, but it was an excellent coach, that, you know what, you're just standing in the way of the person who has this job ever developing or ever succeeding. That's what you're really doing. And there, you know, again, because she was a nice person. But this business of managing perceptions is something that women often have very low tolerance for somebody saying, whoa, what's wrong with her? You know, people say that about you in a leadership position often. You know, it's not good to be, it's not, I don't want to say good, it's not helpful to you to be overly invested in assuring the unquestioning good behavior, a good opinion of every single person you ever meet.
Yeah, it's just got me thinking about so many things. But first off, if we go back to Frances Hesselbein, she would say, be intentional, but she wouldn't say be intentional about having people like you. She'd say be intentional about your strategic goals. So it's what's best for kids. It's about improving instruction. It's about building the efficacy of teachers or whatever it might be, but it's not that people like me. And I'm a little bit of too much obsessed with that. And what I found, and now in my senior citizen years, is that it's a bit like a water balloon. Like you can try to please them all the time, but at some point, a little prick is going to put a hole in the balloon and it's gone anyway. And so it's kind of a no-win situation. You're going to reach a point where you don't please people. And so you just got to accept the fact that what I have to do here, especially the more you're in a leadership position, I have to do what's best for the strategic goal.
Yeah. And you really articulated it perfectly when you talked about Frances. The antidote to being a pleaser is to get very, very clear about what your intention is. What do you intend to contribute? Because pleasers tend to put being liked above what they're trying to contribute. And you can see why that becomes extremely problematic at higher levels. And I would say it's a trap that coaches can often fall into, wanting to have that, you know, oh, you're the most wonderful coach. I mean, we've all felt good when people have said that, but are they saying that because we haven't held them to account for reaching their full potential? Or we've just made them feel good?
I'm watching the clock and we're running out of time, and my heart is breaking because I have so many things I want to ask you, but I have a few I want to touch on. You talk about follow-up as one of the defining characteristics of effective leadership. Would you be so kind as to tell me a bit about that? What do you mean by follow-up?
Well, talking in the context of How Women Rise, follow-up means that when you begin to practice a different habit or behavior, when you recognize that something has gotten in your way, say you're a pleaser, you recognize that. You recognize that the antidote is going to be being more intentional. You recognize you're a perfectionist and you see that the antidote is going to be learning to prioritize more, to say, you know, how important is it actually in the large scheme of things that every detail here is right? So once you begin to identify a new behavior, the follow-up is really holding yourself to account for acting on it. And that is most effectively done, as any coach knows, by enlisting and engaging other people to notice, to give you feedback, to give you what Marshall calls feed forward, practicing that kind of informal enlistment to hold yourself to account. That's the way we follow up.
Well, and that's where peer coaching comes in. So could you say a bit about, I know you've had a peer coach, and Marshall talks about his coach he's had for a long, long time. What's the role of the peer coach?
The peer coach, I have had the same peer coach for 11 years. And when I first heard about peer coaching, I thought this is a fantastic idea. And what my peer coach and I do is we create every month a sort of intention or objective of what we're trying to work on. And it could be, for her, it's often around organizational issues or following through on a commitment she's made to write. For me, it's often about trying to figure out how I'm going to balance everything, turning stuff down that I don't actually, isn't as valuable because I've got so many invitations, whatever that is. Or it can be, just my general incredible resistance to social media and sort of claiming my achievements publicly. But whatever it is we're working on, the whole marketing area, we look at what our intention is for that month, where it's going to crop up for us. And then we formulate a couple questions to ask each other every day so that we can hold one another to account. And it has been so remarkable. This took me through the recession, which was the most challenging time of my life, my professional life for sure. And because I was able to have that feedback and on a regular, really even daily, a daily basis. So I'm a big advocate of peer coaching, especially for those of us who work independently. So we don't really have a budget to have a professional coach necessarily.
So the peer coach, how often do you talk to each other?
Well, we talk about 5 times
Once a week?
About
5 times a week.
Unless
unless
one of us is out of,
right.
Yeah.
But frequently every week. And you have you have sort of a scheduled way in which you say, what are we going to talk about for this month?
Right. And then we can talk about other things if we want, but we kind of have to go through questions to hold ourselves to account. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. It's funny how you could, so I do this thing that Michael Bungay-Stanier taught me of having people ask each other questions and then you ask the question, you can't say a word, you just have to listen, and it goes back and forth. And inevitably people have all kinds of insights. And I think your partner did nothing. They just asked the question and listened. You could read the question and respond, but there's something about having the other person that seems really important. You could create an app to do it, but I think you need a real person,
Oh, I'm big on the real person thing. This outsourcing all these things we can do to an app, I just don't, to me, it's kind of hollow, I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah, I would rather talk to a person than
and
whatever it is, dots on a computer screen.
What Michael Bungay-Stanier talks about is very much what I was describing with Francis before. It's just listening and then not responding, but just listening some more. Right.
How about your to-don't list? What is that all about? What's a to-don't list?
Well, that's something that I developed for myself because I'm a real lister. I list every single thing I do, and I list it every day, and I have multiple lists, and I'm very organized on that. And what I recognize, and it kind of came from listening to one of David White's tape where he talks about, how we can feel like we're a rat in a maze and we're just in the service of our to-do list. And I realized that there were days I felt like that. I just picked up my little book and I looked at it and I thought, no, I've got to do all this. And so what I decided to do for someone like me was to also have a to-don't list. And that's a list of things that I can give myself a pass on, that I don't have to do, that I want to consider not doing, etc. So that I don't feel tyrannized by my to-do list, because when you're the kind of person who naturally resonates with a to-do list, you can lose the ability to really be present and show up for your days, because your days just become an opportunity. What David White calls your logistical mind is going every minute. Okay, now I'm done with that. Now I can do this. And it's a way, to me, it's a little bit of a way of turning off that logistical mind. So like when I'm in, now this isn't going to happen and it hasn't happened since March, but when I'm in an airport, take the time when I'm in the lounge to read and reflect rather than oh, I can get this done, etc. So having these things that I'm not going to do when I'm doing something else.
It's quite a few questions on Facebook, but I just pulled out two and I want to ask them quickly. Great questions. To some extent, you've answered them though. So if you feel you've already answered it, you can just say, I think we've covered that. So the first one is, do you have any advice for women in the workforce, and you've been answering this all day, but women in the workforce who face the challenge of others taking credit for their work before even getting a chance to try to seek acknowledgement for the work?
Oh, that happens. That happens a lot. Yes, exactly. The best thing to do is, if it happens publicly, don't let it go. The least effective thing you can do is then, you let it go, you feel irritated or annoyed, you grab another woman and say, can you believe that nobody can hear a woman when she talks? The best thing to do is right there publicly, but with some humor and some lightness. I'm so glad you agree with my idea. That's terrific. I've been talking about in the last meeting, I'm sure you recall when I talked about this, and it's wonderful to know that you agree with me. And I think we should, have a discussion and look at how we might together move this forward. So acting as if you're sure the other person, this is all goodwill. That is a
Right.
much better thing than you're like, I can't believe. So I think that that's an effective thing. And then if it's not public, you always have to look at that. The person who's in, Peter Drucker always used to say the decision gets made by the person who's got the power to make the decision. And in hierarchies, the credit gets allocated, if that person wants it, to the person whose purview that lies under. So if it's your boss, you're the head of, I've had this a lot of work with a lot of pharma and biotech, your boss is taking credit for the work you did at your bench. That's just the reality of that company. It's not a good boss, because they're not encouraging, motivating, nurturing, but it's the reality. And in that kind of case, if that happens over and over, you might want to consider, being in a different division or whatever, or just getting comfortable with that, but letting people know informally, we had this great success. Here was my role in it. That you can always say that. That's not taking credit away from the team. It's like, here we had this great success. It was, here's what I did. Here's what I contributed. So you can tell people that. That's fair.
So what I'm hearing is, if you speak up in goodwill, you can get your message across in a way that that actually will probably be heard more powerfully if you take it that way.
I've always found that speaking up with goodwill or from a place of humor is much more effective than a defensiveness. And even if it's not true, even if the person was trying to hog the credit, that's fine. Act as if that's the last possible thing on your mind.
Right. Last question, then I have one more question. Last question, second question from Facebook is, what are some fears women face as aspiring new leaders, and how might they overcome them? And I know you've been addressing this today, but is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the biggest fear that I hear women who are aspiring leaders face is that someone will find them out. It comes back to that sort of imposter syndrome. Find them out, find that they don't have all the skills that they thought that they had, find out that they weren't fully ready for this job, find out that they were not the best choice. And women spend a lot of time worrying about this. I rarely see men, especially men who become quite successful, who are worried about this. Oh, maybe I wasn't really ready for this job. What will people think if they see? So that's what I see as the biggest fear, the fear of being found out as someone who wasn't ready. So you need to be able to change that story you're telling yourself. You need to be able, whether it's saying, these people chose me, they know something, I'm going to trust them because, they know what they want done. or telling yourself the story, you know, I know that I have worked very, very hard and I've learned a lot that I'm not even aware that I've learned. I do this sometimes, that I'm not even aware that I've learned. And so I'm going to trust that I will be able to handle this situation. And then I'm also going to trust that I will know who to ask for help.
Well, having helpers is really, really something I've learned from you about its importance. My last question is your "Oh well" mantra. You want to tell me what that is?
Okay, quickly. OL mantra. It has to do with ruminating and going over and over and over your mistakes, which is common with women.
Mhm.
And research shows it's much more common among women. Marshall and I were working one day in his apartment. He had an apartment in New York. And we never took phone calls. And the phone rang. It was his assistant. And I heard him. He was going, "Oh, I was supposed to call Dr. Kim. It's 2:00. Okay." And he looked at me and he hung up and he said, "Oh, well." And I thought, really? Because I knew who Dr. Kim was. You may know too. It was Jim Kim, CEO of the World Bank. And as I was coming back home on the train, I was thinking, okay, if I missed calling the CEO of the World Bank, would I be going to myself, "Oh, well"? No, I would be questioning every minute of my life. You know, I'm totally qualified. What does the guy think of me? I can't believe I did this. You know, I'd be going on and on down the rabbit hole in my mind. So the next morning, so I was thinking that is unbelievable, very Marshall. The next morning, I got a text early from about an article I'd written where I'd gotten a small fact wrong. And it was only online, so I was able to correct it. But when I learned that from the editor, I started to go down the whole thing. Oh, what's the guy going to think of me? He's going to think I'm a terrible writer, reporter. I can't get my facts straight. I've been doing this, 45 years, and this is what happened. So I was really giving myself a hard time. And then it just almost came to me, this, "Oh, well." And so I made a big sign. I took the biggest font my pencil would accommodate, and I made a big sign. I put it on my office wall. "Oh, well," to remind myself. And I've come to believe that mantras are the best sort of way of interrupting that thought process, and that it's something people really benefit from. And I go all over the world where women come up and say, "I've got stickies all over my house that say 'Oh, well' on them to remind me." So I think it's quite effective.
It is. I'm going to work on it. I think it's a great one. I wish we could talk more, but I don't want to take more of your time. I've noticed that it's getting darker and darker in my room. So, but I do want to say a couple things. Just first off, sincerely, I learned so much from this conversation. It was a pleasure. But I know we're talking about how women rise, but I really feel you've helped me see through a lot of important things. Probably a lot more importantly, I am certain there are women who are going to listen to your talk today and their lives will be different because of the things you shared. It's powerful and important. And it's just really great that you're spreading the word about the fact that people can achieve more than they realize. And they need to recognize that there are simple things they can do to help them unleash their brilliance, So I'm grateful. I know you have a website, sallyhelgesen.com. If people just Google your name, they're going to find all kinds of videos online. I know you're on LinkedIn, and the book, as I've mentioned a number of times, How Women Rise, is a great book. It's accessible and powerful, and I'm so grateful for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation. And
thank you, Jim. I enjoyed the opportunity to meet this really important, to talk to this really important audience.
Oh, great. I'm going to use you as an ally now, though. So this is the thing. You taught me I have to do that. So I'm going to be seeking you out.
Very good.
Thank you. Have a great holiday. Thank you so much. And we'll see you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.